The Beeching cuts refer to the reduction of route network and restructuring of the railways in Great Britain outlined in two reports, The Reshaping of British Railways and The Development of the Major Railway Trunk Routes, written by Dr Richard Beeching and published by the British Railways Board. The first report identified 2,363 stations and 5,000 miles of railway line for closure, 55% of stations and 30% of route miles, with an objective of stemming the large losses being incurred during a period of increasing competition from road transport and reducing the rail subsidies necessary to keep the network running. The second identified a small number of major routes for significant investment. The 1963 report also recommended some less well-publicized changes, including a switch to containerisation for rail freight. Protests resulted in the saving of some stations and lines, but the majority were closed as planned, and Beeching's name remains associated with the mass closure of railways and the loss of many local services in the period that followed. A few of these routes have since reopened. Some short sections have been preserved as heritage railways, while others been incorporated into the national cycle network or used for road schemes, with others now lost to construction, simply reverted to farmland, or remain derelict. Background: after growing rapidly in the 19th century during the railway mania, the British railway system reached its height in the years immediately before the First World War, with a network of 23,440 miles. After the First World War, the railways faced increasing competition from a growing road transport network, which led to the closure of some 1,300 miles of passenger railway between 1923 and 1939. Some of these lines had never been profitable and were not subject to loss of traffic in that period. The railways were busy during World War II, but at the end of the war they were in a poor state of repair, and were soon nationalised as British Railways. The Branch Lines Committee of the British Transport Commission was formed in 1949 with a brief to close the least used branch lines, 3,318 miles. If railway were closed between 1948 and 1962. Closures in this period included the Charnwood Forest Railway, closed to passengers in 1931, the Harborne Line in Birmingham, closed to passengers in 1934, and the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway, closed in 1959. This period saw the beginning of a closures protest movement led by the Railway Development Association, whose most famous member was the poet John Betjeman. They went on to be a significant force resisting the Beeching proposals. Economic recovery and the end of petrol rationing led to rapid growth in car ownership and use. Vehicle mileage grew at a sustained annual rate of 10% between 1948 and 1964. In contrast, railway traffic remained steady during the 1950s, but the economics steadily deteriorated, with labor costs rising faster than income and fares and freight charges repeatedly frozen by the government to try to control inflation. By 1955, income no longer covered operating costs, and things got steadily worse. The 1955 modernization plan promised expenditure of over £1,240 million. Steam locomotives would be replaced with diesel and electric locomotives. Traffic levels would increase and the system was predicted to be back in profit by 1962. Instead, losses mounted, from £68 million in 1960 to £87 million in 1961, and £104 million in 1962. the BTC could no longer pay the interest on its loans. The government lost patience and looked for radical solutions. By 1961, losses were running at £300,000 a day. Since nationalisation in 1948, 3,000 miles of line had been closed. Railway staff numbers had fallen 26% from 648,000 to 474,000, and the number of railway wagons had fallen 29% from 1,200,000 to 848,000. The Beeching reports. The Reshaping of British Railways. The report The Reshaping of British Railways was published on the 27th of March 1963. The problem. The report starts by quoting the brief provided by the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, from 1960. First, the industry must be of a size and pattern suited to modern conditions and prospects. In particular, the railway system must be modelled to meet current needs, and the modernisation plan must be adapted to this new shape, and with the premise that the railways should be run as a profitable business. Beeching first studied traffic flows on all lines to identify the good, the bad, and the indifferent. His analysis showed that the least used 1,762 stations had annual passenger receipts of less than £2,500 each. That over half of the 4,300 stations open to passengers in 1960 had receipts of less than £10,000. That the least used 50% of stations contributed only 2% of passenger revenue, and that 1/3 of route miles carried just 1% of passengers. By way of example, he noted that the line from Thetford to Swaffham carried 5 trains each weekday in each direction, carrying an average of 9 passengers, with only 10% of the costs of operating the line covered by fares. Another example was the Gleneagles-Creef-Comrie line, which had 10 trains a day and 5 passengers on average, earning only 25% of costs. Finally, there was the service from Hull to York via Beverley. The line covered 80% of its operating costs, but he calculated that it could be closed because there was an alternative, but less direct route. The recommendations. Out of 18,000 miles of railway, Beeching recommended that 6,000 miles, mostly rural and industrial lines, should be closed entirely, and that some of the remaining lines should be kept open only for freight. A total of 2,363 stations were to close, including 435 already under threat, both on lines that were to close and on lines that were to remain open. He recommended that freight services should mainly be for minerals and coal, and that the freight system made use of new containerised handling systems rather than less efficient and slower wagon load traffic. This was eventually adopted with Freightliner. He recommended further electrification of the West Coast Main Line from Crewe to Glasgow in 1974. Staff terms and conditions were to be improved. Over time, the development of the major railway trunk routes. On the 16th of February 1965, Beeching announced the second stage of his reorganisation of the railways, in the development of the major railway trunk routes. In this report he set out his conclusion that of the 7,500 miles of trunk railway, only 3,000 miles should be selected for future development and invested in. This policy would result in traffic being routed along 9 lines. Traffic to Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and Scotland would be routed through the West Coast Main Line to Carlisle and Glasgow. Traffic to the northeast would be concentrated through the East Coast Main Line, which was to be closed north of Newcastle, and traffic to Wales and the West Country would go on the Great Western Main Line to Swansea and Plymouth. Underpinning Beeching's proposals was his belief that there was too much duplication in the railway network. The real choice is between an excessive and increasingly uneconomic system, with a corresponding tendency for the railways as a whole to fall into disrepute and decay, or the selective development and intensive utilization of a more limited trunk route system. Of the 7,500 miles of trunk route, 3,700 miles involves a choice between two routes, 700 miles a choice of 3, and over a further 700 miles a choice of 4. In Scotland, only the Central Belt routes and the lines via Fife and Perth to Aberdeen were selected for development, and none were selected in Wales, apart from the Great Western Main Line as far as Swansea. Beeching's secondment from ICI ended early in June 1965 after Harold Wilson's attempt to get him to produce a transport plan failed. It is a matter of debate whether Beeching left by mutual arrangement with the government or if he was sacked. Frank Cousins, the Labour Minister of Technology, told the House of Commons in November 1965 that Beeching had been dismissed by Tom Fraser. Beeching denied this, pointing out that he had returned early to ICI as he would not have had enough time to undertake an in-depth transport study before the formal end of his secondment. The closures. The first report was accepted by the government, but many of the closures it recommended sparked protests from communities that would lose the trains, many of which had no other public transport. The government argued that many services could be provided more cheaply by buses. Line closures, which had been running at about 150 to 300 miles per year between 1950 and 1961, peaked at 1,000 miles in 1964 and had come to a virtual halt by the early 1970s. One of the last major closures was the 98-mile-long Waverley route between Carlisle, Hawick and Edinburgh in 1969. The reopening of a 35-mile section of this line was approved in 2006 and passenger services resumed in September 2015. Not all the recommended closures were implemented. Reprieve lines include lines through the Scottish Highlands, such as the Far North Line, were kept open, in part because of pressure from the powerful Highland lobby. The Central Wales Line was said to have been kept open because it passed through so many marginal constituencies that no one dared to close it. The Tamar Valley Line in Devon and Cornwall was kept open because the local roads were poor. Other routes planned for closure that survived include the Settle Carlisle Line, Ipswich Lowestoft, Manchester Sheffield via Edale, Buxton Line, Ayr Stranraer, Glasgow Kilmarnock, Glasgow Edinburgh via Shotts, Barrow Whitehaven, Middlesbrough Whitby, York Harrogate, Leeds, Bradford Ilkley, Nottingham Lincoln, Boston Skegness, Birkenhead Wrexham, Liverpool Southport, Bury Manchester, Leicester Peterborough, Hastings Ashford and Ryde Shanklin. The Beeching report was intended to be the first stage in the rail network's contraction. As a result, some lines that he had not recommended for closure were subsequently shut down, such as the Woodhead line between Manchester and Sheffield in 1981, after the freight traffic on which it had relied declined. Most of the Oxford-Cambridge Varsity line closed despite its strategic location serving Milton Keynes, Britain's largest new town. Kinrossshire and Fife especially suffered closures not included in the report, including the main line from Edinburgh to Perth. Kings Lynn was to have remained at the centre of routes towards Norwich, Hunstanton and Wisbech, all of which closed, with a few exceptions. After the early 1970s, proposals to close other lines were met with vociferous public opposition and were quietly shelved. This opposition likely stemmed from the public experience of the many line closures during the cuts in the mid and late 1960s. Critical analysis. Disposals of land and structures. Beeching's reports made no stipulation for the handling of land after closures. British Rail operated a policy of disposing of land that was surplus to requirements. Many bridges, cuttings and embankments have been removed and the land sold for development. Closed station buildings on remaining lines have often been demolished or sold for housing or other purposes. Increasing pressure on land use meant that protection of closed trackbeds as in other countries was not seen to be practical. Many redundant structures from closed lines remain, such as bridges over other lines and drainage culverts. These often require maintenance as part of the rail infrastructure while providing no benefit. Critics of Beeching argue that this demonstrates the short-sighted aspect of the report's approach. On the other hand, it does not automatically follow that retaining a railway on these routes, which would obviously increase the cost of maintaining them, would have earned enough to justify that greater cost. As demand for rail has grown since privatization, the failure to preserve the routes of closed lines, for example between Bedford and Cambridge, has been criticized. Acceptance of rail subsidies. By 1968 the railways had not been restored to profitability and Beeching's approach appeared to many to have failed. It has been suggested that by closing almost a third of the network Beeching achieved a saving of just £30 million, whilst overall losses were running in excess of £100 million per year. However, the precise savings from closures are impossible to calculate. The Ministry of Transport subsequently estimated that rail operating costs had been cut by over £100 million in the wake of the Beeching report, but that much of this had been swallowed up by increased wages, although in some cases closures removed branches that acted as feeders to the main lines and that feeder traffic was lost when the branches closed. The financial significance of this is debatable, as over 90% of the railway's 1960 traffic was carried on lines which remained open 10 years later. Whatever the correct figures, towards the end of the 1960s it became increasingly clear that rail closures were not bringing the rail system out of deficit and were unlikely ever to do so. Transport Minister Barbara Castle stipulated that some rail services that could not pay their way but had a valuable social role should be subsidized. Legislation allowing this was introduced into the 1968 Transport Act, though this was later repealed in the Railways Act 1974. Whether these subsidies affected the size of the network is questionable. The criteria for reprieving loss-making lines had not altered, merely the way their costs appeared in the railway's accounts. Previously, the contribution to the railway's overall loss was hidden in the total deficit. Replacement buses and proposed alternatives. The bustitution policy that replaced rail services with buses also failed. In many cases the replacement bus services were slower and less convenient than the trains they were meant to replace, and so were unpopular. Replacement bus services were often run between the station sites, thus losing any potential advantage over the closed rail service. Most replacement bus services lasted less than 2 years before they were removed due to a lack of patronage, leaving large parts of the country with no public transport. The assumption at the time was that car owners would drive to the nearest railhead and continue their journey onwards by train. In practice, having left home in their cars, people used them for the whole journey. Similarly for freight, without branch lines, the railway's ability to transport goods door-to-door was dramatically reduced. As in the passenger model, it was assumed that lorries would pick up goods and transport them to the nearest railhead, where they would be taken across the country by train, unloaded onto another lorry and taken to the destination. The development of the motorway network, the advent of containerisation, improvements difference in lorries and the economic costs of having to break bulk points combine to make long-distance road transport a more viable alternative. Many of the closed lines ran at only a small deficit. Some lines such as the Sunderland to West Hartlepool line cost only £291 per mile to operate. Closures of such small-scale loss-making lines made little difference to the overall deficit. The Beeching reports recommended against attempts to make loss-making lines profitable. Changing to light railway-type operations were attacked by Beeching, who wrote, "The third suggestion, that rail buses should be substituted for trains, ignores the high cost of providing the route itself, and also ignores the fact that rail buses are more expensive vehicles than road buses." There is little in the Beeching report recommending general economies. For example, a number of the stations that were closed were fully staffed 18 hours a day, on lines controlled by multiple Victorian-era signal boxes. Operating costs could have been reduced by reducing staff and removing redundant services on these lines while keeping the stations open. This has since been successfully done by British Rail and its successors on lesser-used lines that survived the cuts, such as the East Suffolk line from Ipswich to Lowestoft, which survives as a basic railway. Such recommendations were absent from the Beeching reports. Some of the closed routes would now be heavily used, possibly even important trunk routes. The Settle Carlisle Railway was threatened with closure, reprieved, and now handles more traffic than at any time in its history. The Great Central Main Line, the last trunk route built in Britain until the opening of High Speed 1 in 2007, was intended to provide a link to the north of England from a proposed Channel tunnel. It was built to the larger continental loading gauge and constructed to the same standards as a modern high-speed line, with no level crossings, and curves and gradients kept to an absolute minimum. This line closed in stages between 1966 and 1969 after just 60 years of service. 28 years before the opening of the Channel Tunnel rail link, there has been discussion about High-Speed 2 linking the tunnel to the north of England and Scotland. While this route would have been served by a simple extension of the closed line's original function, it would now be very difficult and expensive to construct, as much of the former GC route has been levelled or built over. The Marsh-Link line between Ashford and Hastings, threatened with closure in the Beeching report, is now seen as important due to the opening of the Channel Tunnel and High Speed 1. Traffic on the single-track Golden Valley line between Kemble and Swindon and the Cotswold line between Oxford and Worcester has increased significantly, and double track has now been reinstated on the Golden Valley line.